Well, good morning and welcome to Before the Day Ends. We are very glad that you're joining us today as we're diving into the fifth book of Matthew, specifically chapter 22. What's going on in chapter 22? Well, first off, we're seeing the conflict between Jesus and religious leaders kind of coming to a head. As we get closer and closer to Jesus' trial and crucifixion, we're going to see kind of this growing momentum of revealing what the Pharisees were really after, what the religious leaders were really after, and what Jesus is really after, and how those two things are going to kind of come into conflict. So in the beginning of chapter 22, Jesus tells a story about a person who gives a wedding banquet. And in the wedding banquet, he invites everyone to come, but those who were invited decide not to show up. And in the story, that's kind of the religious leaders, the Jewish establishment. They don't want to come to God's big banquet. And so God invites everyone else to come in, the lame, the sick, the outcast, the tax collectors, all they get to come into the kingdom. Well, that, of course, angers the religious leaders who think that they're God's chosen, that that's who God wants. And so this conflict then begins to where they want to now punish Jesus, they want to trap Jesus, they want to have him killed eventually. So Matthew 22, verse 15, is the beginning of that story. So let's take a look there. We're going to kind of break it up a bit more today. I want to just take it a little piece by piece and kind of show the story as it develops of what's going along. So in verse 15, then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. So again, they want to trap him. This is not a matter of an honest question, not at all. They want him to say the wrong thing and get into trouble. So they think they're being clever. They're not being honest. They're trying to be clever and dishonest. They bring the Herodians, and the Herodians were actually kind of their enemies in a sense. The Herodians were all about Rome, all about giving Rome what Rome wanted. And so the Pharisees were all about the Jewish people and giving them what they wanted, or at least what the leadership wanted. Let's put it that way. So now these two enemies, the Pharisees and Herodians, are kind of coming together over a common enemy, Jesus. And so we see this happen in our lives today, where people that are normally enemies will come together to fight another enemy, right? So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that kind of mentality. So they come and they say this, "Teacher," stop right there. I know it's one word, but just a reminder, in the Gospel of Matthew, those who follow Jesus, like the disciples, except for Judas, like the Canaanite woman, call Jesus Lord, Adonai, right? Again, harking back to Yahweh. Those who don't believe him, like here the Herodians and the Pharisees, those who don't follow him, call him Rabbi or teacher. So again, right from the beginning, we see Matthew saying, hey, these folks are not being honest. They don't want to follow Jesus. They're in it for another reason. "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality." So they start off by flattering him, right? They say, hey, we know that you're sincere. We know that you tell the truth. We know that you teach God's way. We know that you don't show partiality. You're like this perfect teacher. I mean, if you think about it, this really describes a perfect teacher. A teacher who is sincere, who teaches God's way in accordance with the truth, doesn't show partiality, isn't pulled to one side or the other based on political opinions. We see that a lot again in our world today, where people will take a direction that they don't agree with because they don't want to be made fun of or ridiculed by the mob. So they will actually go against what they believe. They show deference to a perspective because they don't want to stand for truth or courage or those kinds of things. So they flatter him into saying, hey, you know what? We think that you are a great and perfect teacher. Verse 17, here's their question. "Tell us then what you think." Right? We want to know what you think. Tell us what you think. "Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" Simple question. Is it lawful to pay taxes? Now, when they say lawful, they're talking more religious lawful, right? I mean, obviously Rome sets the laws, so if it's their law, it's lawful to them. But they're asking, is it lawful as a follower of God to pay taxes to the emperor? Now, here's the trap. If he says, no, don't pay taxes, well, the Herodians can say, wait a minute, you're anti-establishment, you're against Rome, you're against the emperor, you're an insurrectionist. we're going to kill you. If he says, pay the taxes, well, there's a problem there too, because the emperor called himself a god. The images on the coins were of him, which would be, in fact, idolatry, right? Because if he thinks he's a god and his image is on the coin, then that's an image of an idol, and that's a problem. Plus, the people hated the taxes, right? The Roman taxes were hurting Jewish people, the farmers and the workers and so forth. In fact, there was a revolt in 6 AD, the Galilean revolt, where they were fighting against these unfair taxes. And so now you have a religious question and a political question. If he says no tax, it's a political issue. If he says yes, pay the tax, it's a religious issue because, hey, it's God's land. God's our God and not the emperor. And so we have this section, this image here where Jesus is kind of caught. Years ago when I was living in Georgia, I went fishing with a friend, and it was a hot day on a small lake, and there's a ton of fish. Well, one of the things you could do if you want to catch fish on a hot day in a small lake is you cast your line kind of underneath, kind of sidearm it to get it under a tree where there's some shade, and they'd hang out where there's some shade because who wants to be in the hot sun? Well, I cast my line, and either the wind caught it or I'm just really bad at this, but it came and it kind of went up and over a branch, and then the lure came down and was hanging just like maybe this far over the top of the water, so it's kind of stuck there. Well, a fish, I guess being an overachiever, comes up and grabs my lure. And now we got a fish literally hung and caught on this line, hanging on a tree, and I can't reel him in because I'm over a branch. And we're kind of like stuck. Like I'm in the boat, stuck. He's on the lure, stuck, right? Eventually we had to actually pull the boat in and cut the line and let the fish go. But my point is that you're kind of stuck, right? He's stuck in between a rock and a hard place. So Jesus knows this. Like, this is not like, they're not hiding what they're doing. They're doing it in plain sight. They're trying to trap him. In verse 18, but Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Like, he said, why are you asking the question? Like, you don't want the answer. You really don't care about the answer. You're testing me. You want to see me say something that's going to get myself in trouble. And he calls them hypocrites. And by the way, this word hypocrite is a Greek word. It's a translation of a Greek word that literally means actor. Right? You are faking being somebody else. In fact, the actors weren't well respected in Jesus' day because they were fake people. And they wanted true people, honest people, people that stood for what is right and weren't afraid to do so. So he calls them actors, you hypocrites. You're putting on a false face to what you're trying to do. He says, then show me the coin used for the tax. And they brought him a denarius, which is interesting because they're talking about, in a sense, this idea of idolatry and the tax and the coins, and they've got them, they're using them. They've got this little coin with Caesar's image on it, this little idol, if you will. So they're already part of the problem. So he's like saying, like, bring me a coin. Oh, you have one. Right? So really, this, again, this is not an honest question. Then he said to them, whose head is this, and whose title? They answered, the emperor's. Then he said to them, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. So he pulls out a coin and says, whose image is on this? Well, the emperor's. Well, then give him that. Right? If his image is on it, he owns it, it represents him, give him that. That's what the emperor wants. What about the other half of this? So if we know what the emperor wants, give him that. What does God want? What bears God's image? Well, if you go back to Genesis, you and I do. We bear God's image. We were created in the image of God. Not that we look like God, but rather we bear his authority, if you will, on the earth. We represent him on the earth. We are to bear his character. We are to represent him and his reign and his rule on the earth by the way we live our lives, because we belong to God. We represent God. That's what the image of God is supposed to mean, the imago Dei. Now, that's a lot to take in, but we're called to be God's representatives on the earth. What that means, I think, is this. There's a lot of places in our world today that we find a lack of justice, a lack of compassion, a lack of faith, a lack of forgiveness, a lack of courage. We see things going on that just seem crazy and ridiculous. And we kind of worry about it and say, well, what do we do about all this stuff? Well, instead of focusing on what Caesar wants, focus on being who God called us to be, who God created us to be. So where you don't find justice, be justice. Where you don't find true compassion, I'm talking true, honest compassion, be compassionate. Where you find a lack of forgiveness and hatred and anger, be the one who forgives and shows grace. Where you find a lack of courage, be courageous. See, we are called to be God's representatives in a world that is sometimes very, very dark. But that's what God wants. He wants us to bear His image, to show His kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And we do that by studying His Word, being faithful, prayer, and trying to lead those around us the way God wants us to lead. And that is through service. So I hope this week that you will work harder and I will work harder to bear the image of God in a world that desperately needs it. We'll see you next time before the day ends.